Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more freedom. Today we're going to be continuing our energetic investment into our union by reading aloud from the Federalist Papers. We will be reading 61, 62, and 63 today. It's finishing up the House of Representatives and beginning the Senate. And so we are going to dive in and start. Federalist Paper number 61. The same subject continued concerning the power of Congress to regulate the election of members, from the New York Packet, Tuesday, February the 26th of 1788, authored by Alexander Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. The more, the more candid opposers of the provision respecting elections contained in the plan of the convention, when pressed in argument, will sometimes concede the propriety of that provision, with this qualification, however, that it ought to have been accompanied with a declaration that all elections should be had in the counties where the electors resided. This, they, was a necessary precaution against an abuse of the power. A declaration of this nature would certainly have been harmless, so far as it would have had the effect of quieting apprehensions. It might not have been undesirable, but it would, in fact, have afforded little or no additional security against the danger apprehended, and the want of it will never be considered by an impartial and judicious examiner as a serious, still less as an insuperable objection to the plan. The different views taken on the subject in the two preceding papers must be sufficient to satisfy all dispassionate and discerning men that if the public liberty should ever be the victim of the ambition of the national rulers, the power under examination, at least, will be guiltless of the sacrifice. If those who are inclined to consult their jealousy only would exercise it in a careful inspection of several state constitutions, they would find little less room for disquietude and alarm, from the latitude which most of them allow in respect to elections, than from the latitude which is proposed to be allowed to the national government in the same respect. A review of their situation in this particular would tend greatly to remove any ill impressions which may remain in regard to this matter. But, as that view would lead to a long and tedious details, I shall content myself with the single example of the state in which I write. The Constitution of New York makes no other provision for locality of elections than that the members of the Assembly shall be elected in the counties, those of the Senate in the great districts into which the state is or may be divided. These at present are four in number and comprehend from 2 to 6 counties. It may readily be perceived that it would not be more difficult to the legislature of New York to defeat the suffrages of the citizens of New York by confining elections to particular places than for the legislature of the United States to beat the suffrages of the citizens of the Union by the like expedient. Suppose, for instance, the city of Albany was to be appointed the sole place of election for the county and district of which it is a part. Would not the inhabitants of that city speedily become the only electors of the members both of the Senate and Assembly for that county and district? Can we imagine that the electors who reside in remote subdivisions of the counties of Albany, Saratoga, Cambridge, etc., or in any part of the county of Montgomery, would take the trouble to come to the city of Albany to give their votes for members of the Assembly or Senate, sooner than they would repair to the city of New York to participate in the choice of the members of the Federal House of Representatives? The alarming indifference discoverable in the exercises of so invaluable a privilege under the existing laws, which afford every facility to it, furnishes a ready answer to this question. And, abstracted from any experience on the subject, we can be at no loss to determine that when the place of election is at an inconvenient distance from the elector, the effect upon his conduct will be the same, whether that distance be 20 miles or 20,000 miles. Hence, it must appear that objections to the particular modification of the federal power of regulating elections will, in substance, apply with equal force to the modification of the like power in the Constitution of this state, and for this reason it will be impossible to acquit the one and to condemn the other. A similar comparison would lead to the same conclusion in respect to the constitutions of most of the other states. If it should be said that defects in the state constitutions furnish no apology for those which are to be found in the plan proposed, I answer that as the former have never been thought chargeable with inattention to the security of liberty, where the imputations thrown on the latter can be shown to be applicable to them also. The presumption is that they are rather the cavilling refinements of a predetermined opposition than the well-founded inferences of a candid research after truth. To those who are disposed to consider as innocent omissions in the state constitutions what they regard as unpardonable blemishes in the plan of the convention, nothing can be said. Or at most, they can only be asked to assign some substantial reason why the representatives of the people in a single state should be more impregnable to the lust of power or other sinister motives than the representatives of the people of the United States. If they cannot do this, they ought to at least prove to us that it is easier to subvert the liberties of 3 millions of people, with the advantage of local governments to head their oppositions, than of 200,000 people who are destitute of that advantage. And in relation to the point immediately under consideration, they ought to convince us that it is less probable that a predominant faction in a single state should, in order to maintain its superiority, incline to a preference of a particular class of electors, than that of a similar spirit should take possession of the representatives of 13 states, spread over a vast region, and in several respects distinguishable from each other by a diversity of local circumstances, prejudices, and interests. Hitherto my observations have only been aimed at a vindication of the provision in question, on the ground of theoretic propriety, on that of the danger of placing the power elsewhere, and on that of the safety of placing it in the manner proposed. But there remains to be mentioned a positive advantage which will result from this disposition, and which could not as well have been obtained from any other. I allude to the circumstance of uniformity in the time of elections for the Federal House of Representatives. It is more than possible that this uniformity may be found by experience to be of great importance to the public welfare, both as a security against the perpetuation of the same spirit in the body and as a cure for the diseases of faction. If each state may choose its own time of election, it is possible that there may be at least as many different periods as there are months in the year. The times of election in the several states, as they are now established for local purposes, vary between extremes as wide as March and November. The consequence of this diversity would be that there could never happen a total dissolution or renovation of the body at one time. If an improper spirit of any kind should happen to prevail in it, that spirit would be apt to infuse itself into the new members as they come forward in succession. The mass would be likely to remain nearly the same, assimilating constantly to itself gradual accretions. There is a contagion in example which few men would have sufficient force of mind to resist. I am inclined to think that treble the duration in office, with the condition of a total dissolution of the body at the same time, might be less formidable to liberty than 1/3 of that duration subject to gradual and successive alterations. Uniformity in the time of election seems not less requisite for executing the idea of a regular rotation in the Senate and for conveniently assembling the legislature at a stated period in each year. It may be asked, why then could not a time have been fixed in the Constitution? As the most zealous adversaries of the plan of the convention in this state are, in general, not less zealous admirers of the Constitution of the state, the question may be retorted, and it may be asked, why was not a time for the like purpose fixed in the Constitution of the state? No better answer can be given than that it was a matter which might safely be entrusted to legislative discretion, and that if a time had been appointed, it might, upon experiment, have been found less convenient than some other time. The same answer may be given to the question put on the other side, and it may be added that the supposed danger of a gradual change being merely speculative, it would have been hardly advisable, upon that speculation, to establish, as a fundamental point, what would deprive several states of the convenience of having the elections for their own governments, and for the national government at the same epochs. And so ends Federalist Paper number 61. And this was an argument for setting the time of election to a convenient one, right? That was the overarching theme of this one. It was just, it makes sense to have national elections, right? It makes sense to have them on the same day. It should be all votes cast and counted all in one sitting. It should be observed by every relevant party. If you have a stake in the fight, you should be able to observe. And if it's not observed, it should be tossed out. I stand on that. I believe that. It's not how it's done, but that's what it should be. You should have a vote. You should be sure, beyond any doubt, that it is being counted as it was cast. That is something that should happen. And the longer you drag out the period, the harder that is to do. Everything should be done in one day, if possible, two at the most, right? If you have to recount, make the recount on the third day, and then the fourth day you have firm final elections with paper ballot backups. But it's not up to me. Now we're going to do Federalist paper number 62. And we're starting to deal with the Senate. For the Independent Journal, authored by Alexander Hamilton or James Madison, to the people of the state of New York. Having examined the Constitution of the House of the Representatives and answered such objections against it as seem to merit notice, I enter on the examination of the Senate. The heads into which this member of government may be considered are 1. The qualifications of senators. 2. The appointment of them by state legislatures. 3. The equality of representation in the Senate. 4. The number of senators and the term for which they are to be elected. And 5. The powers vested in the Senate. 1. The qualifications proposed for senators, as distinguished from those of representatives, consist in a more advanced age and a longer period of citizenship. A senator must be 30 years of age at least, as a representative must be 25, and the former must have been a citizen 9 years, as 7 years are required for the latter. The propriety of these distinctions is explained by the nature of the senatorial trust, which, requiring greater extent of information and stability of character, requires at the same time that the senators should have reached a period of life most likely to supply these advantages, and which, participating immediately in transactions with foreign nations, ought to be exercised by none who are not thoroughly weaned from the prepossessions and habits incident to foreign birth and education. The term of 9 years appears to be a prudent mediocrity between a total exclusion of adopted citizens, whose merits and talents may claim a share in the public confidence, and an indiscriminate and hasty admission of them, which might create a channel for foreign influence on the national councils. 2. It is equally unnecessary to dilate on the appointment of senators by the state legislatures. Among the various modes which might have been devised for constituting this branch of government, that which had been proposed by the convention is probably the most congenial with public opinion. It is recommended by the double advantage of favoring a select appointment, and of giving to the state government such agency in the formation of the federal government as must secure the authority of the former, and may form a convenient link between the two systems. 3. The equality of representation in the Senate is another point, which, being evidently the result of compromise between the opposite pretensions of the large and the small states, does not call for much discussion. If, indeed, it be right that among the people thoroughly incorporated into one nation, every district ought to have a proportional share in the government, and that among independent and sovereign states, bound together by a simple league, the parties, however unequal in size, ought to have an equal share in the common councils. It does not appear to be without some reason that in a compound republic, partaking of both the national and the federal character, the government ought to be founded on a mixture of the principles of proportional and equal representation. But it is superfluous to try, by the standard of theory, a part of the Constitution which is allowed on all hands to be the result, not of theory, but of a spirit of amity, and that of mutual deference and concession, which the peculiarity of our political situation rendered indispensable. A common government with powers equal to its objects is called for by the voice, and still more loudly by the political situation of America. A government founded on principles more consonant to the wishes of the larger states is not likely to be obtained from the smaller states. The only option, then, for the former lies in the proposed government, and a government still more objectionable. Under this alternative, The advice of prudence must be to embrace the lesser evil, and, instead of indulging a fruitless anticipation of the possible mischiefs which may ensue, to contemplate rather the advantageous consequences which may qualify the sacrifice. In this spirit it may be remarked that the equal vote allowed to each state is at once a constitutional recognition of the portion of sovereignty remaining in the individual states, and an instrument for preserving that residuary sovereignty. So far, the equality ought to be no less acceptable to the large than to the small states, since they are no less solicitous to guard, by every possible expedient, against an improper consolidation of the states into one simple republic. Another advantage accruing from this ingredient in the constitution of the Senate is the additional impediment it must prove against improper acts of legislation. No law or resolution can now be passed without the concurrence first of a majority of the people and then a majority of the states. It must be acknowledged that this complicated check on legislation may, in some instances, be injurious as well as beneficial, and that the peculiar defense which it involves in favor of the smaller states would be more rational, if any interests common to them and distinct from those of the other states would otherwise be exposed to peculiar danger. But as the larger states will always be able, by their power over the supplies, to defeat unreasonable exertions of this prerogative of the lesser states, and as the faculty and excess of lawmaking seem to be diseases to which our government are most liable, it is not impossible that this part of the Constitution may be more convenient in practice than it appears to be in contemplation. 4. The number of senators and the duration of their appointment come next to be considered. In order to form an accurate judgment on both of these points, it will be proper to inquire into the purposes which are to be answered by a Senate. And in order to ascertain these, it will be necessary to review the inconveniences which a republic must suffer from the want of such an institution. First, it is a misfortune incident to republican government, though in a less degree than to other governments, that those who administer it may forget their obligations to their constituents, and prove unfaithful to their important trust. In this point of view, a Senate, as a second branch of the legislative assembly, distinct from and dividing the power with a first, must in all cases a salutary check on the government. It doubles the security to the people by requiring the concurrence of two distinct bodies in schemes of usurpation or perfidy, where the ambition or corruption of one would otherwise be sufficient. This is a precaution, founded on such clear principles, and now so well understood in the United States, that it would be more than superfluous to enlarge on it. I will barely remark that, as the improbability of sinister combinations will be in proportion to the dissimilarity in the genius of the two bodies, it must be politic to distinguish them from each other by every circumstance which will consist with a due harmony in all proper measures, and with the general principles of republican government. Secondly, the necessity of a Senate is not less indicated by the propensity of all single and numerous assemblies to yield to the sudden impulse of sudden and violent passions, and to be seduced by factious leaders into intemperate and pernicious resolutions. Examples on this subject might be cited without number, and from proceedings within the United States, as well as from the history of other nations. But a position that will not be contradicted need not be proved. All that need be remarked is, that a body which is to correct this infirmity ought to itself be free from it, and consequently ought to be less numerous. It ought, moreover, to possess great firmness, and consequently ought to hold its authority by a tenure of considerable duration. Thirdly, another defect to be supplied by a Senate lies in a want of due acquaintance with the objects and principles of legislation. It is not possible that an assembly of men, called for the most part from pursuits of a private nature, continued in appointment for a short time, and led by no permanent motive to devote the intervals of public occupation to a study of the laws, the affairs, and the comprehensive interests of their country, should, if left wholly to themselves, escape a variety of important errors in the exercise of their legislative trust. It may be affirmed on the best grounds that no small share of the present embarrassments of America is to be charged on the blunders of our governments, and that these have proceeded from the heads rather than the hearts of most of the authors of them. What indeed are all the repealing, explaining, and amending laws which fill and disgrace our voluminous codes, but so many monuments of deficient wisdom, so many impeachments exhibited by each succeeding against each preceding session, so many admonitions to the people of the value of those aids which may be expected from a well-constituted Senate. A good government implies two things. First, fidelity to the object of government, which is the happiness of the people. Secondly, a knowledge by the means by which that object can be best obtained. Some governments are deficient in both these qualities. Most governments are deficient in the first. I scruple not to assert that in American governments too little attention has been paid to the last. The federal Constitution avoids this error, and what merits particular notice, it provides for the last a mode which increases the security for the first. Fourthly, the mutability in the public councils arising from a rapid succession of new members, however qualified they may be, points out in the strongest manner the necessity of some stable institution in the government. Every new election in the states is found to change one half of the representatives. From this change of men must proceed a change of opinions, and from a change of opinions a change of measures. But a continual change, even of good measures, is inconsistent with every rule of prudence and every prospect of success. The remark is verified in private life and becomes more just, as well as more important, in national transactions. To trace the mischievous effects of a mutable government would fill a volume. I will hint a few only, each of which will be perceived to be a source of innumerable others. In the first place, it forfeits the respect and confidence of other nations and all the advantages connected with national character. An individual who is observed to be inconstant to his plans, or perhaps to carry on his affairs without any plan at all, is marked at once, by all prudent people, as a speedy victim to his own unsteadiness and folly. His more friendly neighbors may pity him, but all will decline to connect their fortunes with his, and not a few will seize the opportunity of making their fortunes out of his. One nation is to another what one individual is to another, with this melancholy distinction perhaps that the former, with fewer of the benevolent emotions than the latter, are under fewer restraints also from taking undue advantage from the indiscretions of each other. Every nation, consequently, whose affairs betray a want of wisdom and stability, may calculate on every loss which can be sustained from the more systematic policy of their wiser neighbors. But the best instruction on this subject is unhappily conveyed to America by the example of her own situation. She finds that she is held in respect by her friends, that she is the derision of her enemies, and that she is the prey to every nation which has an interest in speculating on her fluctuating counsels and embarrassed affairs. The internal effects of a mutable policy are still more calamitous. It poisons the blessing of liberty itself. It will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice, if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood. If they be repealed or revised before they are promulgated, or undergo such incessant changes that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it will be tomorrow. Law is defined to be a rule of action, but how can that be a rule which is little known and less fixed? Another effect of public instability is the unreasonable advantage it gives to the sagacious, the enterprising, and the moneyed few over the industrious and uninformed mass of the people. Every new regulation concerning commerce or revenue, or in any way affecting the value of the different species of property, presents a new harvest to those who watch the change and can trace its consequences. A harvest reared not by themselves, but by the toils and cares of the great body of their fellow citizens. This is a state of things in which it may be said with some truth that laws are made for the few, not for the many. In another point of view, great injury results from an unstable government. They want a confidence in the public councils damp every useful undertaking. The want of confidence in the public councils damps every useful undertaking, the success and profit of which may depend on the continuance of existing arrangements. What prudent merchant will hazard his fortunes in any new branch of commerce when he knows not, but that his plans may be rendered unlawful before they can be executed? What farmer or manufacturer will lay himself out for the encouragement given to any particular cultivation or establishment, when he can have no assurance that his preparatory labors and advances will not render him a victim to an inconstant government? In a word, no great improvement or laudable enterprise can go forward which requires the auspices of a steady system of national policy. But the most deplorable effect of all is that the diminution of attachments and reverence, which steals into the hearts of its people towards a political system which betrays so many marks of infirmity, and disappoints so many of their flattering hopes. No government, any more than an individual, will long be respected without being truly respectable, nor be truly respectable without possessing a certain portion of order and stability. And so ends Federalist Paper number 62. And there was a good bit to digest here. The Senate is meant to be more stable. It is meant to be the stabilizing force of the government. We're not supposed to have laws that we can't read and understand. Isn't that interesting? It's not supposed to have attached to it things that make it different. Isn't that interesting? And the Senate is supposed to be the stabilizing force of that, as well as being the stabilizing force against unnecessary and ill-advised attempts to remove the executive branch. And that's generally what has happened, right? We haven't actually had an impeachment because it hasn't passed both houses. Even though, caught up in the passions of factionism, which is talked about here, they in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, they said, we're going to impeach this guy for a thing that isn't even real. That happened. But they sent it to the Senate, and the Senate said, shut up, go away. Right? That's how that went down. I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty close. That's how it's supposed to go down. The Senate is supposed to be the stabilizing force because it is supposed to be people who are a little bit more stable. It was not intended to be left up to us. Indirect, right? So we're not supposed to, according to the founders, directly vote for our senators or the president. The senators are supposed to be put into place by the legislature, by the House of Representatives. We vote for the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives then select senators and send them. And then there's electors in the Electoral College, and that's how we select the president. And it's not supposed to be by the popular vote, by intention. But the Senate is supposed to be our stabilizing force in a changing world. It is supposed to be the part that deals with our treaties, our trade agreements, and our things that are supposed to take a little bit more knowledge. We have a really bad problem with they spend more time getting money to campaign for the position than they actually do doing the position that they are supposed to be in. Federalist Paper number 63. The Senate continued for the Independent Journal, authored by Alexander Hamilton or James Madison, to the people of the state of New York. Oh boy. A fifth desideratum. I don't know that word. Illustrating the utility of a Senate is the want of a due sense of national character. Without a select and stable member of the government, the esteem of foreign powers will not only be forfeited by an unenlightened and variable policy, proceeding from the causes already mentioned, but the national councils will not possess that sensibility to the opinion of the world, which is perhaps not less necessary in order to merit than it is to obtain its respect and confidence. An attention to the judgments of other nations is important to every government for two reasons. The one is that independently of the merits of any particular plan or measure, it is desirable on various accounts that it should appear to other nations as the offspring of a wise and honorable policy. The second is that in doubtful cases, particularly where the national councils may be warped by some strong passion or momentary interest, the presumed or known opinion of the impartial world may be the best guide that can be followed. What has not America lost by her want of character with foreign nations? And how many errors and follies would she not have avoided if the justice and propriety of her measures had, in every instance, been previously tried by the light in which they would probably appear to the unbiased part of mankind? Yet, however requisite a sense of national character may be, it is evident that it can never be sufficiently possessed by a numerous and changeable body. It can only be found in a number so small that a sensible degree of the praise and blame of public measures may be the portion of each individual, or in an assembly so durably invested with public trust that the pride and consequence of its members may be sensibly incorporated with the reputation and prosperity of the community. The half-yearly representatives of Rhode Island would probably have been little affected in their deliberations on the iniquitous measures of that state by arguments drawn from the light in which such measures would be viewed by foreign nations, or even by the sister states, whilst it can scarcely be doubted that if the concurrence of a select and stable body had been necessary, a regard to national character alone would have prevented the calamities under which that misguided people is now laboring. I add, as a sixth defect, the want, in some important cases, of a due responsibility in the government to the people, arising from that frequency of elections which, in other cases, produces this responsibility. This remark will, perhaps, appear not only new, but paradoxical. It must nevertheless be acknowledged, when explained, to be as undeniable as it is important. Responsibility, in order to be reasonable, must be limited to objects within the power of the responsible party, and in order to be effectual, it must relate to operations of that power, of which a ready and proper judgment can be formed by the constituents. The objects of government may be divided into two general classes, the one depending on measures which have singly an immediate and sensible operation, the other depending on a succession of well-chosen and well-connected measures, which have a gradual and perhaps unobserved operation. The importance of the latter description to the collective and permanent welfare of every country needs no explanation, and yet it is evident that an assembly elected for so short a term as to be unable to provide more than one or two links in a chain of measures on which the general welfare may essentially depend, ought not to be answerable for the final result, any more than a steward or tenant engaged for 1 year could be justly made to answer for places or improvements which could not be accomplished in less than half a dozen years. Nor is it possible for the people to estimate the share of influence which their annual assemblies may respectively have on events resulting from the mixed transactions of several years. It is sufficiently difficult to preserve a personal responsibility in the members of the numerous body, for such acts of the body have an immediate, detached, and palpable operation on its constituents. The proper remedy for this defect must be an additional body in the legislative department, which, having sufficient permanency to provide for such objects as require continued attention, and a train of measures, may be justly and effectually answerable for the attainment of those objects. Thus far I have considered the circumstances which point out the necessity of a well-constructed Senate, only as they relate to the representatives of the people. To a people as little blinded by prejudice or corrupted by flattery as those whom I address, I will not scruple to add that such an institution may sometimes be necessary as a defense to the people against their own temporary errors and delusions. As the cool and deliberate sense of the community ought, in all governments, and actually will, in all free governments, ultimately prevail over the views of its rulers. So there are particular moments in public affairs when the people, stimulated by some irregular passion or some illicit advantage, or misled by the artful misrepresentations of interested men, may call for measures which they themselves will afterwards be most ready to lament and condemn. In these critical moments, how salutary will be the interference of some temperate and respectable body of citizens, in order to check the misguided career and to suspend the blow meditated by the people against themselves, until reason, justice, and truth can regain their authority over the public mind. What bitter anguish would not the people of Athens have often escaped if their government had contained so provident a safeguard against the tyranny of their own passions? Popular liberty might then have escaped the indelible reproach of decreeing to the same citizens the hemlock on one day and the statues on the next. It may be suggested that a people spread over an extensive region cannot, like the crowded inhabitants of a small district, be subject to the infection of violent passions, or to the danger of combining in pursuit of unjust measures. I am far from denying that this is a distinction of peculiar importance. I have, on the contrary, endeavored in a former paper to show that it is one of the principal recommendations of a confederated republic. At the same time, this advantage ought not to be considered as superseding the use of auxiliary precautions. It may even be remarked that the same extended situation which will exempt the people of America from some of the dangers incident to lesser republics will expose them to the inconveniency of remaining for a longer time under the influence of those misrepresentations which the combined industry of men may succeed in distributing among them. It adds no small weight to all these considerations to recollect that history informs us of no long-lived republic which had not a senate. Sparta, Rome, and Carthage are, in fact, the only states to whom that character can be applied. In each of the first two there was a senate for life. The constitution of the senate in the last is less known. Circumstantial evidence makes it probable that it was not different in this particular from the two others. It is at least certain that it had some quality or other which rendered it an anchor against popular fluctuations, and that a smaller council, drawn out of the Senate, was appointed not only for life, but filled up vacancies itself. These examples, though as unfit for the imitation, as they are repugnant to the genius of America, are, notwithstanding, when compared with the fugitive and turbulent existence of other ancient republics, very instructive proofs on the necessity of some institution that will blend stability with liberty. I am not unaware of the circumstances which distinguish the American from other popular governments, as well as ancient as modern, and which render extreme circumspection necessary in reasoning from one case to the other. But after allowing due weight of this consideration, it may still be maintained that there are many points of similitude which render these examples not unworthy of our attention. Many of the defects, as we have said, which can only be supplied by a senatorial institution, are common to the numerous assembly frequently elected by the people, and to the people themselves. There are others peculiar to the former, which require the control of such an institution. The people can never wilfully betray their own interest, but they may possibly be betrayed by the representatives of the people, and the danger will be evidently greater where the whole legislative trust is lodged in the hands of one body of men than where the concurrence of separate and dissimilar bodies is required in every public act. The difference most relied on between the American and other republics consists in the principle of representation, which is the pivot on which the former move, and which is supposed to have been unknown to the latter, or at least to the ancient part of them. The use of which has been made of this difference in reasonings contained in the former papers will have shown that I am disposed neither to deny its existence nor to undervalue its importance. I feel the less restraint, therefore, in observing that the position concerning the ignorance of the ancient governments on the subject of representation is by no means precisely true in the latitude commonly given to it. Without entering into disquisition, which here would be misplaced, I will refer to a few known facts in support of what I advance. In the most pure democracies of Greece, many of the executive functions were performed not by the people themselves, but by officers elected by the people, and representing the people in their executive capacity. Prior to the reform of Solon, Athens was governed by 9 archons, annually elected by the people at large. The degree of power delegated to them seems to have been left to great obscurity. Subsequent to that period, we find an assembly, first of 4 and afterwards of 600 members, annually elected by the people and partially representing them in their legislative capacity. Since they were not only associated with the people in the function of making laws, but had the exclusive right of originating legislative propositions to the people, the Senate of Carthage also, whatever might be its power or the duration of its appointment, appears to have been elective by the suffrages of the people. Similar instances might be traced in most, if not all, of the popular governments of antiquity. Lastly, in Sparta we meet the Ephori, and in Rome with the tribunes, 2 bodies, indeed small in numbers, but annually elected by the whole body of the people and considered as representatives of the people, almost in their plenipotentiary capacity. The Cosmi of Crete were also annually elected by the people, and have been considered by some authors as an institution analogous with those of Sparta and Rome, with this difference only, that in the election of that representative body the right of suffrage was communicated to a part only of the people. From these facts, to which many others might be added, it is clear that the principle of representation was neither unknown to the ancients nor wholly overlooked in their political constitutions. The true distinction between these and the American governments lies in the total exclusion of the people, in their collective capacity, from any share in the latter, and not in the total exclusion of the representatives of the people from the administration of the former. The distinction, however, thus qualified, must be admitted to leave a most advantageous superiority in favor of the United States. But to ensure to this advantage its full effect, we must be careful not to separate it from the other advantage of an extensive territory. For it cannot be believed that any form of representative government could have succeeded within the narrow limits occupied by the democracies of Greece. In answer to all these arguments, suggested by reason, illustrated by examples, and enforced by our own experience, the jealous adversary of the Constitution will probably content himself with repeating that a Senate appointed not immediately by the people and for the term of 6 years must gradually acquire a dangerous preeminence in the government, and finally transform it into a tyrannical aristocracy. To this general answer, the general reply ought to be sufficient, that liberty may be endangered by the abuses of liberty, as well as by the abuses of power, that there are numerous instances of the former as well as the latter, and that the former, rather than the latter, are apparently most to be apprehended by the United States. But a more particular reply may be given. Before such a revolution can be effected, the Senate, it is to be observed, must in the first place corrupt itself, must next corrupt the state legislatures, must then corrupt the House of Representatives, and must finally corrupt the people at large. It is evident that the Senate must first be corrupted before it can attempt an establishment of tyranny. Without corrupting the state legislatures, it cannot prosecute the attempt, because the periodical change of members would otherwise regenerate the whole body. Without exerting the means of corruption with the equal success on the House of Representatives, the opposition of that co-equal branch of the government would inevitably defeat the attempt, and without corrupting the people themselves, a succession of new representatives would speedily restore all things to their pristine order. Is there any man who can seriously persuade himself that the proposed Senate can, by any possible means within the compass of human address, arrive at the object of lawless ambition through all of these obstructions? If reason condemns the suspicion, the same sentence is pronounced by experience. The Constitution of Maryland furnishes the most apposite example. The Senate of that state is elected, as the federal Senate will be, indirectly by the people, and for a term less by 1 year only than the federal Senate. It is distinguished also by the remarkable prerogative of filling up its own vacancies within the term of its appointment, and at the same time it is not under the control of any such rotation as is provided for by the federal Senate. There are some lesser distinctions which would expose the former to colorable objections that do not lie against the latter. If the federal Senate, therefore, really contained the danger which has been so loudly proclaimed, some symptoms at least of a like danger ought to by this time to have been betrayed by the Senate of Maryland. But no such symptoms have appeared. On the contrary, the jealousies at first entertained by men of the same description with those who view with terror the correspondent part of the federal Constitution have been gradually extinguished by the progress of the experiment. And the Maryland Constitution is daily deriving from the salutary operation of this part of it a reputation in which it will probably not be rivaled by that of any state in the Union. But if anything could silence the jealousies on this subject, it would be the British example. The Senate there is, instead of being elected for a term of 6 years and of being unconfined to particular families or fortunes, is a hereditary assembly of opulent nobles. The House of Representatives, instead of being elected for 2 years, and by a whole body of the people, is elected for 7 years, and, in a very great proportion, by a very small proportion of the people. Here, unquestionably, ought to be seen in full display the aristocratic usurpations and tyranny which are at some future period to be exemplified in the United States. Unfortunately, however, for the anti-federal argument, the British history informs us that this hereditary assembly has not been able to defend itself against the continual encroachments of the House of Representatives, and that it no sooner lost the support of the monarch than it was actually crushed by the weight of the popular branch. As far as antiquity can instruct us on this subject, its examples supporting the reasoning which we have employed in Sparta, the Ephori, the annual representatives of the people, were found an overmatch for the Senate for life, continually gained on its authority, and finally drew all power into their own hands. The tribunes of Rome, who were the representatives of the people, prevailed, it is well known, in almost every contest with the Senate for life, and in the end gained the most complete triumph over it. The fact is the more remarkable, as unanimity was required in every act of the tribunes, even after their number was augmented to 10. It proves the irresistible force possessed by that branch of a free government, which has the people on its side. To these examples might be added that of Carthage, whose Senate, according to the testimony of Polybius, instead of drawing all power into its vortex, had, at the commencement of the Second Punic War, lost almost the whole of its original portion. Besides the conclusive evidence resulting from this assemblage of facts that the federal government will never be able to transform itself by gradual usurpations into an independent and aristocratic body, we are not warranted in believing that if such a revolution should ever happen from causes which the foresight of man cannot guard against, the House of Representatives, with the people on their side, will at all times be able to bring back the Constitution to its primitive form and principles. Against the force of the immediate representatives of the people, nothing will be able to maintain even the constitutional authority of the Senate, but such a display of enlightened policy and attachment to the public good as will divide with that branch of the legislature the affections and support of the entire body of the people themselves. Publius. And so ends Federalist paper number 63, and this is where we're going to wrap it up today. And This was, again, talking about the checks against the Senate. The House of Representatives is supposed to be able to check the power of the Senate, but the Senate is a check against the legislature. And that is intentional, right? One of them is meant to be quick and fast moving, and the other one is meant to be slow and a tempering measure. And so the two should be separate. They should be widely kept apart, right? Our two-party system has thrown a kink into things that would be a lot simpler if we ran with no parties and it was simply the people, and you had to instead research the person that you were putting in there instead of trying to just rely on the R or the D behind their name. The last recourse of freedom is us. It is the responsible, informed citizen. And if you're watching this far, then it's you, right? And so we are meant to be the check that holds both the Senate and the legislature in balance. We are supposed to hold the executive in balance. We are the last check against the judicial as well. It is the informed and active electorate that is our defense against the tyranny of a democracy. And I know that sounds contradictory, but democracy is ruled by the mob. The mob is normally stupid. Like people in general, a person is smart, people are dumb. And you can go back and check out it was Men in Black. That's the movie. It was on Men in Black, right? People are smart. One person is smart. A group of people is going to do dumb things. It's generally how it works. There are exceptions to that rule, but generally speaking, the Congress is meant to be a little bit dumb. They're meant to jump up and scream and yell and try to get stuff done and get some changes done, because sometimes we need changes. And the Senate is supposed to be more conservative and look at these things and say, no, that's stupid. We're not doing that. Or, hey, that's actually a good idea. Let's discuss that. Hey, let's vote on this and send it down up the chain. It's supposed to be a slower, more deliberate process. And this is outlining the fact that it's supposed to be a series of checks and balances against each other. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a not too difficult topic, right? There wasn't a whole lot to add to this. Most of this is self-explanatory. I always encourage you to check out the link down below and go back, read it for yourselves. Make sure I did it right. But to the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. This has been PittCast. Peace.